What did growing old actually mean for people living centuries ago? Back in the years of the 1300s, 1400s, and 1500s, did men and women experience their twilight years in the same way? Were their lives shaped by similar expectations? Or did the very paths of old age diverge dramatically based on whether you were a man or a woman in the medieval world? Number 6. Perceptions and cultural representations. The stories people told, the art they created, and the plays they watched offered powerful insights into how medieval society viewed its elders. These cultural images often painted very different pictures for older men compared to older women. For an aging man, the common narrative often celebrated wisdom, experience, and continued authority. Chroniclers frequently described aged rulers like King Louis IX of France or Emperor Frederick II as figures of immense knowledge and venerable presence, their white beards and stooped shoulders a sign of years spent in council and leadership. Artwork from the period, such as illuminated manuscripts illustrating biblical scenes or historical events, frequently depicted old men with long flowing robes, seated on thrones or at council tables, their expressions serious and thoughtful. Fresco from the 14th century in a northern Italian church shows an old man, perhaps a patriarch or a saint, surrounded by younger followers, all listening intently to his words. His hands are clasped, and his gaze is directed outwards, conveying a deep sense of contemplation. He is shown with a staff, a symbol of journey and wisdom, resting against his side. Sculptures on cathedral portals often featured aged prophets or apostles, their faces etched with lines that were meant to convey a lifetime of divine understanding and spiritual journey. These depictions were not merely decorative. They were part of a widespread understanding of what it meant for a man to grow old. A man's age could be seen as an accumulation of spiritual grace, practical knowledge, and strategic insight. In tales and romances, the wise old knight or the seasoned merchant often provided crucial advice or guidance to the young hero. An anonymous 15th century English poem, known as The Assembly of Ladies, subtly highlights the respect accorded to an aged knight, detailing his measured speech and the attention paid to his pronouncements during a courtly gathering. His quiet demeanor, rather than diminishing his presence, seemed to amplify it. The very act of aging for a man could lead to a reinforced position as a repository of knowledge, a living library of historical events and family lore. Village elders, though not often depicted in grand art, were known within their communities for their long memories, their ability to recount events from decades past, and their understanding of traditional customs and laws. Records from manorial courts across England indicate that the testimonies of older male villagers were often given significant weight in property disputes or boundary definitions, precisely because of their long personal recall of local history. Their voices carried a weight that youth could not yet possess. Even in death, the effigies on tombs often showed men in their prime, or with a dignified older appearance, their hands often clasped in prayer, signifying a peaceful and revered passage. The imagery aimed to convey a sense of eternal rest for someone who had completed a life of purpose and respect. However, the cultural mirror held up to older women often reflected a very different and frequently less flattering image. While there were exceptions, particularly for saintly figures or powerful queens who managed to project authority despite common gendered expectations, the prevailing narrative for older women was often one of diminishing social value, frailty, or even malevolence. Artwork rarely depicted older women in positions of power or wisdom, outside of specific religious contexts like depictions of Saint Anne or Saint Elizabeth. Instead, they were more often shown as domestic figures, sometimes bent with age, engaged in household chores or prayer. A German woodcut from the early 16th century portrays an old woman hunched over a spinning wheel, her face wrinkled and her expression somewhat grim, focusing on her labor rather than any outward wisdom. Her presence in the frame suggests a life of continued toil, rather than a transition to revered elder. When not shown as working figures, older women in popular culture could veer into much darker archetypes. The hag or crone became a common, negative representation. This figure was often toothless, ugly, ill-tempered, and sometimes associated with gossip, malice, or even witchcraft. Ballads and folk tales circulated throughout Europe, featuring old women who were portrayed as tricksters, purveyors of bad luck, or outright agents of evil. A French fabliau, a short humorous tale from the 13th century, describes an old woman who is the source of all conflict in her village, her sharp tongue and spiteful nature causing constant trouble. The depiction was rarely sympathetic. During the periods of heightened witchcraft accusations, particularly in the later medieval and early modern periods, older women, especially those who were poor, widowed, or lived alone, became disproportionately targeted. Court records from trials across Europe show that the physical appearance of an older woman, her wrinkles, her sometimes unusual movements, her perceived strangeness could be interpreted as signs of her pact with dark forces. Pamphlets circulated showing grotesque caricatures of older women consorting with demons or casting malevolent spells. This was not merely artistic license. It was a deeply ingrained cultural fear. Even when an older woman was not explicitly labeled a witch, her old age could be associated with gossip, nagging, or meddling. Proverbs from medieval England included phrases that suggested old women were prone to chatter and fussiness, rather than quiet wisdom. A common saying implied that an old woman's advice was to be taken with a grain of salt, perhaps because her mind was thought to be less sharp or her opinions less grounded. The narrative of an older woman gaining respect purely through her longevity was less common than for a man. Her value often remained tied to her past roles as a mother of many children or as a diligent wife. Once those roles diminished in the public eye, her sidereal worth could also seem to dwindle. Even older women, who were known for their piety, spending their days in prayer and charity, were often depicted in a way that emphasized their asceticism or their humble nature rather than any active, authoritative presence. An illuminated initial from a Book of Hours shows a devout old woman kneeling, her face serene, but her posture suggests submission and quiet devotion rather than active spiritual leadership. The contrast in these cultural representations highlights a fundamental difference in how medieval society viewed male and female aging. For men, age could be a ladder to greater respect and authority. For women, it often meant a descent into either invisibility, domestic drudgery, or potentially a dangerous and negative stereotype. These were the images and stories that shaped the collective understanding of growing old for medieval men and women, guiding their own perceptions and the perceptions of those around them. Number 5. Prods in religion and spirituality. In the medieval world, faith was not just a part of life. It was often the very foundation of daily existence. As individuals approached old age, their engagement with religious and spiritual practices could shift, and these shifts often played out differently for men and for women. For older men, the Church provided numerous avenues for continued spiritual growth, leadership, and community involvement. Some men, who had lived a secular life, might choose to enter a monastery in their later years, seeking a life of quiet contemplation, study, and prayer. These late vocations were not uncommon, especially for widowers, or those who had achieved a certain level of worldly success and now desired spiritual retreat. Chronicles from various Benedictine and Cistercian abbeys describe men in their 50s and 60s joining the monastic community, bringing with them not only their personal wealth but also their life experiences, and, sometimes, their scholarly pursuits. A man named Thomas, a retired merchant from London in the early 14th century, is documented in the records of a monastery near Canterbury, having given all his remaining property to the abbey in exchange for a place to live out his days in monastic devotion. He spent his time in the scriptorium, meticulously copying religious texts. For men who remained in the secular world, old age often brought increased prominence within their local parish church. They might serve as church wardens, overseeing the practical affairs of the parish, managing its property, and ensuring the upkeep of the church building. This was a position of considerable responsibility and respect within the community. Records from an English parish in the 15th century detail how two older men, John and William, were consistently elected as church wardens year after year. Their long-standing presence and perceived reliability making them ideal candidates. Older men were also often prominent members of confraternities, which were lay religious brotherhoods dedicated to specific saints, charitable works, or religious devotion. These groups provided social support, opportunities for communal prayer, and organized processions and festivals. A confraternity in Florence, dedicated to St. John the Baptist in the 1300s, included a significant number of older male members who held positions of authority within the organization, guiding its charitable activities and ensuring its adherence to religious principles. Pilgrimages, too, were a significant spiritual undertaking, and many older men, upon reaching old age or retirement, would embark on long journeys to holy sites like Santiago de Compostela in Spain or Rome in Italy. These arduous travels were seen as acts of penance, a way to secure divine favor for their souls, or simply a deep expression of their faith. The narratives of these journeys, sometimes recorded by chroniclers, often praised the physical and spiritual fortitude of these older pilgrims. For some, old age was a time for deeper theological study, for reading sacred texts, or for engaging in intellectual debates within academic or ecclesiastical circles. Men who had been scholars or clerics throughout their lives often continued their intellectual pursuits into their later years, becoming revered figures whose interpretations of Scripture and theological insights were highly valued. The spiritual path for older men often offered a clear progression toward greater veneration and a more prominent role within the structured religious life of the time. For older women, the religious and spiritual path also offered avenues for devotion, but these often diverged from those available to men and sometimes presented unique challenges or societal perceptions. While women could enter convents, particularly if they were widows or had no marriage prospects, the options for female monastic life were generally less varied and sometimes less prestigious than for men. Many convents were cloistered, meaning the nuns lived in strict seclusion, limiting their external influence. However, within these walls, older nuns could become abbesses or prioresses, holding significant administrative and spiritual authority over their communities. An abbess of a Benedictine convent in Germany in the 12th century, for example, is recorded as a formidable intellectual and spiritual leader, overseeing not only her nuns, but also significant land holdings. For many older women who remained in the secular world, their religious lives often centered around domestic piety and charitable works. They were often the primary educators of their grandchildren in religious matters, teaching prayers and Bible stories within the home. This role was significant, shaping the spiritual foundation of future generations. Older women were also frequently involved in charitable activities, caring for the sick, the poor, and the needy in their communities. They might volunteer at local hospitals or almshouses, providing comfort and practical assistance. Wills from the period frequently show older women leaving bequests for the poor, for the upkeep of their parish church, or for specific religious institutions. A will from a widow in 15th century Norwich, England, explicitly designates funds for the care of poor and aged women in her parish, indicating a direct concern for the welfare of her community. Another significant spiritual role for older women was that of the devout widow. Having fulfilled their marital duties and often raised their children, many widows devoted themselves entirely to God, spending their days in prayer, fasting, and contemplation. Some lived as recluses, sometimes within a small cell attached to a church, dedicating their lives to solitary spiritual devotion. These women were often revered for their piety and seen as models of spiritual commitment. Accounts from the medieval Low Countries describe the Beguines, communities of religious women who lived together without formal vows, often engaging in charitable work and a life of simple devotion. Many older women joined these communities, finding a supportive environment for their spiritual aspirations. However, a darker side to the perception of older women in a religious context existed, particularly in the later medieval period. The accusation of witchcraft. As mentioned earlier, older women, especially those who were perceived as unusual, isolated, or who practiced traditional healing with herbs and folk remedies, could become targets of suspicion. Their knowledge of herbal remedies, which had been passed down through generations, could be reinterpreted as dark magic. This fear, fueled by popular superstition and in some cases by ecclesiastical pronouncements, placed many older women in a precarious position. Parish records, combined with the scattered legal documents from the time, reveal instances where elderly women were questioned or even tried for supposedly using malevolent spells. A record from a village in France in the late 1400s describes an elderly woman being accused of blighting crops through her evil eye, simply because she had walked past a field that subsequently yielded a poor harvest. This fearful perception was a stark contrast to the veneration often accorded to older men in spiritual roles. While older men might deepen their spiritual authority, older women faced a complex landscape where their piety could be celebrated, but their age and independence could also tragically make them vulnerable to dangerous accusations. The path to spiritual fulfillment for medieval men and women, while both deeply interwoven with the Church, took distinctly different turns in their later years. Number 4. Health and physical care. The medieval world was a challenging place to live, and reaching old age meant an individual had survived numerous hurdles, from childhood diseases to famines and conflicts. However, old age itself brought its own set of physical challenges, and the ways in which these were experienced and managed often differed significantly for men and women. For older men, their physical health in later life was often shaped by the demanding manual labor they had performed throughout their lives, or for the noble class by the rigors of warfare and hunting. A lifetime of working in the fields, wielding tools, or maintaining a trade could lead to chronic issues such as joint pain, back problems, and worn-out limbs. A farmer who had spent decades plowing land with heavy oxen would likely suffer from persistent aches in his shoulders and knees by the time he reached his 60s. Records from monastery infirmaries, which sometimes treated lay people, occasionally mention older male patients suffering from aches of the joints or pains in the back, terms that likely described arthritis or similar conditions. Injuries sustained earlier in life, such as fractures from falls or wounds from tools, would often plague them in old age, perhaps leading to persistent lameness or reduced mobility. Military veterans, if they survived their campaigns, often carried the scars of battle, old sword wounds, broken bones that had healed imperfectly, or even chronic infections. A knight in his later years might find himself unable to mount his horse without assistance, or his hand might tremble too much to hold a quill steady, a direct result of his younger, more active life. Access to formal medical care, which was rudimentary by modern standards, was often tied to wealth and social standing. Wealthy older men might consult university-trained physicians who, while limited in their understanding, could offer advice on diet, purgatives, or herbal remedies. Records from a noble household in 14th century France show payments made to a physician who regularly attended to the aging lord, prescribing poultices for his gout and ordering specific baths for his aches. For common men, care was more likely to come from local healers, barbers, who also performed minor surgeries, or family members. If a man was the head of his household, his family was generally expected to care for him. Sons and daughters-in-law would take on the responsibility of ensuring he was fed, clothed, and had access to warmth and comfort. A will from a miller in England dated 1488 explicitly states that his eldest son is to provide good and sufficient sustenance and care for his aging father until his death, indicating a clear expectation of care. His well-being was often seen as directly tied to the honor of his lineage. Despite physical ailments, older men were often still expected to maintain a degree of mental sharpness and, if possible, some level of supervisory involvement in their affairs. Their minds were seen as potentially retaining their acuity even as their bodies failed. For older women, their health experiences in medieval old age were profoundly shaped by a lifetime of gender-specific burdens, particularly childbirth and domestic labor. Women often endured multiple pregnancies and births throughout their fertile years, which could take an enormous toll on their bodies. Complications from childbirth, such as prolapse or chronic infections, could lead to long-term discomfort and health issues that would persist into old age. While men might suffer from injuries related to heavy lifting, women's bodies were often impacted by repetitive domestic tasks: grinding grain, kneading dough, spinning wool, carrying water, and tending to the hearth. These tasks, performed daily for decades, could lead to issues like chronic musculoskeletal pain, respiratory problems from smoke inhalation in smoky medieval homes, and repetitive strain injuries. A woman in her 50s or 60s might suffer from persistent coughs from the hearth, or her hands might be permanently stiff from years of spinning and weaving. Malnutrition, especially in times of famine or scarcity, could also affect women differently, particularly if they had been pregnant or nursing during such periods, depleting their nutritional reserves more severely than men. The prevalence of anemia, often linked to iron deficiency and heavy menstruation, would also contribute to general weakness and fatigue in old age. Access to formal medical care was often even more restricted for women than for men. While wealthy women might also consult physicians, the primary caregivers for most women were other women: midwives, herbalists, and female family members. Midwives who were experienced in childbirth often also possessed knowledge of women's ailments and herbal remedies passed down through generations. These informal networks of care were crucial. If an older woman was widowed, her financial situation could dramatically impact her access to care. With no husband to provide for her, she might become dependent on her children or charity. A widow in 14th century Paris, documented in a charitable register, received regular provisions from a local almshouse because she was too infirm to work and had no direct family support. This highlights the vulnerability of older women who lacked male providers. The concept of frailty was often more directly and negatively applied to older women. While an old man might be seen as venerable despite his physical decline, an old woman's physical weakness was often simply accepted as a natural and often lamentable consequence of her age and past roles. There was less of a societal expectation for her to retain a strong, active public presence as her body failed her. Her physical decline often meant a retreat into the private sphere of the home, becoming dependent on others for her daily needs. In some extreme cases, older women with debilitating conditions might be seen as a burden, particularly in poorer households, and sources from various regions mention older widows being forced into workhouses or almshouses, or relying on communal charity if family support was insufficient or absent. The very act of living long as a medieval woman meant navigating a different set of physical demands and health challenges compared to her male counterpart, with varying degrees of societal support and medical attention. Number 3. living arrangements, and family support. The comfort and security of medieval old age often depended heavily on living arrangements and the support received from family. These structures were not uniform across all social classes, but they consistently displayed gender-specific patterns, dictating who lived where, with whom, and under what terms. For older men, particularly those who owned land or held a trade, the expectation was often to remain in their own homes, heading the household even if their adult sons gradually took over the active management of the family enterprise. A father, even if his hands were gnarled with age and his steps unsteady, would retain ownership of the farm, the workshop, or the business. His sons would work the land or the trade, but they did so under his authority, and often in anticipation of inheritance. Court rolls from various English manors in the 14th century show numerous instances where an older man, often referred to as the elder, would grant his son permission to work a certain plot of land or operate a specific mill, but only with the express condition that the father would retain a share of the profits for his lifetime. This system ensured his continued sustenance and status. He would eat at the head of the table, his wisdom consulted, and his commands, though perhaps less frequent, would still carry weight. This arrangement, known as co-residence with devolution, meant that the younger generation provided care in exchange for future inheritance. A well-documented example from a German peasant family in the 15th century shows a formal agreement where the aging father transferred operational control of the farm to his eldest son, but explicitly reserved for himself and his wife a specific room in the house, a certain amount of grain each year, and the right to keep a cow. His position as head of the family, even if titular, remained undisputed. If an older man was a widower, he might continue to live with his adult children, often a son and his wife. In such cases, he would typically be a respected elder, still maintaining a degree of independence and often having his own dedicated space within the household. He might contribute to household tasks in lighter ways, perhaps mending tools, telling stories to grandchildren, or offering advice on farming decisions. The obligation to care for an aging father was deeply ingrained in the societal fabric. Neglect of an elderly parent, particularly a father, was seen as a serious dereliction of duty and could carry significant social stigma. Wills often stipulated conditions for care, with the inheritance being contingent on the fulfillment of these obligations. A will from a French nobleman in the late 1300s, for instance, outlined in meticulous detail the care his 3 sons were expected to provide him in his declining years, including specific meals, a warm bed, and attendance at his bedside. If an older man had no surviving children, or his children were unable or unwilling to provide care, he might turn to the church or communal charity. Some almshouses and hospitals, often founded by wealthy patrons, provided shelter and basic care for the aged, though these were typically reserved for the truly destitute. In some cases, a man might sell his remaining property to an institution in exchange for lifelong care, a sort of medieval pension plan. For older women, particularly widows, their living arrangements in old age were often far more precarious and dependent. While a married woman typically remained in her husband's home, alongside him in old age, widowhood presented a significant transition. After her husband's death, a woman's right to her marital home and property, while protected by dower rights, a portion of her husband's estate, typically 1/3 for her lifetime, was often subject to complex legalities and the goodwill of her children, especially her sons. Many widows found themselves moving in with one of their adult children, most often a son and his wife, or sometimes a married daughter. This was not always a choice. It could be a necessity. Her financial independence might be severely limited, especially if her dower rights were small or difficult to enforce. The dynamics within these multi-generational households could be challenging. While some older women were welcomed and revered, contributing their wisdom and skills, such as childcare, spinning, or managing household affairs, Others might find themselves in a more subordinate position, their authority diminished compared to the wife of the head of the household. A letter from a 15th century English family, discovered among private correspondence, alludes to tensions between an aging mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law over control of the household kitchen, hinting at the potential for conflict. For a widow, the support she received was heavily contingent on her relationships with her children and their spouses. If she had no children, or if her children were estranged, poor, or deceased, her situation could become desperate. Women who had not been able to accumulate personal wealth, or whose dowry had been fully absorbed into their husband's estate, were particularly vulnerable. These women might be forced into a state of poverty, relying on the charity of their community or seeking refuge in almshouses. Records from medieval charitable institutions indicate a disproportionately high number of elderly women among their residents, illustrating their vulnerability. A register from a poorhouse in Tours, France in the 13th century, lists several aged widows among its inhabitants, noting their lack of family support. Some older women, particularly those with no family, or who sought a life of piety, might enter convents or religious communities. This offered a degree of security, sustenance, and companionship, though it meant renouncing the secular world. The Beguine movement in the Low Countries, as mentioned, provided a notable alternative for women seeking a communal religious life outside traditional convents, attracting many older women who sought spiritual fulfillment and mutual support. Unlike men who often retained the symbolic headship of the household even when frail, older women rarely held such a position unless they were wealthy widows who actively managed their own estates, a rarer circumstance. Their role shifted from active household manager to dependent, or to a less direct, more advisory role within a son's or daughter's household. The path of living arrangements and family support for medieval men in their old age typically centered on maintaining control and respect within their established homes, while for women, it often involved a transition to dependence, frequently necessitating a move and a shift in authority dynamics, highlighting a significant divergence in their experiences. Number 2. Social status and influence. The passage into old age in medieval society brought about significant shifts in social status and influence, and these changes were markedly different for men and for women. The roles they played, the respect they commanded, and the authority they wielded often followed divergent paths as the years accumulated. For older men, age could frequently lead to an enhancement of their social standing. A man who had lived a long life was often seen as a repository of wisdom, experience, and historical knowledge. In village communities, older men were frequently consulted on matters of custom, tradition, and local disputes. Their long memories of who owned what land, how certain agreements were made, or what past events had unfolded within the community were invaluable. Manorial court records from 14th century England reveal instances where the testimony of ancient men was sought to resolve land boundaries or inheritance claims, their recollections carrying significant weight due to their longevity and perceived impartiality. These men often held positions of informal but very real authority within their communities, guiding decisions and offering counsel to younger generations. They might be chosen as village elders, advising the local lord, or presiding over informal community gatherings. A chronicle from a German town in the 15th century describes the Council of Elders, composed exclusively of men who had reached a certain age and whose experience was highly valued in civic matters, from managing common lands to negotiating with outside authorities. In the higher echelons of society, aging noblemen often retained or even increased their political and military influence, while their physical participation in warfare might diminish. Their strategic minds and diplomatic skills became paramount. Older lords might serve as trusted advisors to kings, mentored to young princes, or negotiators in complex treaties. A prime example is the aging king, Edward III of England, whose later years, despite physical ailments, were marked by continued political maneuvering and the shaping of foreign policy through his experienced counsel. Bishops and abbots, if they lived to old age, often commanded even greater spiritual and temporal authority, their accumulated years lending gravity to their pronouncements and sanctity to their persons. Their vast knowledge of Scripture, church, law, and administration was a powerful asset. Beyond formal positions, older men often wielded significant influence within their own families as patriarchs. Their word was generally considered law, and their blessing was sought for marriages, business ventures, and personal decisions. Their accumulated wealth, land, or trade skills gave them continued leverage over their adult children, who often depended on future inheritance. A prosperous merchant in Genoa in the 13th century, though perhaps no longer actively traveling, would maintain control over his extensive trading network, his sons managing the daily operations under his ultimate direction, his long-standing reputation in the trading world securing his family's standing. His social network, built over decades, continued to be an asset, connecting his family to powerful figures and lucrative deals. The respect and authority accorded to older men often permeated every layer of medieval society, reinforcing their position as central figures in their families and communities. For older women, the trajectory of social status and influence in old age was often quite different, and frequently more complex or fraught with challenges. While some older women, particularly those of noble birth or substantial wealth, could maintain considerable influence, the common experience for many was a shift towards diminished public authority and sometimes even marginalization. A woman's social status in her younger years was often largely tied to her husband and her ability to bear children, particularly sons. In old age, as fertility ceased and her husband either passed away or became infirm, her direct power base could erode. If she was a widow, her influence was often contingent on her ability to manage her dower property effectively and to maintain good relationships with her adult children. A wealthy widow, particularly one with a significant dowry or inherited land, could indeed be a formidable figure, managing her own estates, engaging in legal disputes, and overseeing large households. Records from 15th century England show several examples of powerful lady of the manor, widows who actively administered their lands, collected rents, and even held their own manorial courts, exerting considerable control over their tenants. These women, often called dames or mistresses, could command respect through their economic power and administrative acumen. However, such instances were more the exception than the rule. For the majority of women, old age often meant a retreat from public life into a more private, domestic sphere. Their influence often became informal, as grandmothers mentored to younger women within the household or as purveyors of domestic knowledge and skills. An older woman might be revered for her knowledge of herbal remedies, her ability to mend clothes, or her skill in preparing food, but these were typically seen as household contributions rather than public acts of influence. Parish records reveal older women serving as midwives or informal healers, roles that were vital but not always recognized with the same formal authority as male roles. Some older women, particularly those who were pious, might gain a degree of respect through their religious devotion. As mentioned previously, devout widows who dedicated their lives to prayer or charity were sometimes seen as models of piety. However, this respect was largely spiritual and often did not translate into temporal authority or public influence in the same way as it might for an older man entering a religious order or becoming a church warden. A particularly harsh reality for older women was the potential for their age to be associated with negative stereotypes and, tragically, with accusations of witchcraft. While older men might be seen as wise, older women could be perceived as frail, senile, gossipy, or even malevolent. These stereotypes could lead to social ostracization. An old woman living alone, perhaps, with a peculiar appearance or behavior, could become a target of suspicion and fear within a community. The influence she exerted in such cases was often negative. The fear of her potential curses or evil eye. Records from various medieval court proceedings show older women being accused of malevolent acts based on little more than local gossip and their advanced age. This starkly contrasts with the veneration often accorded to aging men. In many ways, an older woman's social status was largely dependent on her personal circumstances, her surviving family, and her ability to maintain a useful role within a household or community, rather than a generalized automatic elevation of status that often accompanied old age for men. The journey of social influence for medieval men and women took distinctly different paths, with men often ascending to greater respect and authority, while women frequently faced a more challenging and sometimes precarious landscape. Number 1. Economic standing and property. The economic standing of medieval men and women in their old age was profoundly shaped by the prevailing legal and customary systems of property, ownership, inheritance, and labor. These systems created vastly different realities for how men and women could maintain their financial security and control over assets as they aged. For older men, their economic standing in old age was generally more secure and often associated with continued control over significant assets. Medieval society was largely patriarchal, and land, the primary form of wealth, was overwhelmingly owned and inherited by men. A man who reached old age, especially one who owned land, a workshop, or a successful trade, would typically retain direct control over these assets until his death. Even if he became physically infirm, he often remained the legal owner and ultimate decision-maker regarding his property. His sons would work the land or the trade, but they did so as his agents or in anticipation of their inheritance. The concept of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the bulk of the estate, meant that land and wealth usually remained within the male line. This provided a powerful incentive for sons to support their aging fathers, as their future prosperity was directly tied to the father's continued goodwill and eventual demise. Records from manorial courts across England from the 13th to 15th centuries show numerous examples of surrender and re-grant arrangements, where an aging male tenant would surrender his land to the lord, who would then re-grant it to the son, often with the express condition that the son would provide for his parents for their remaining lives. This formalized the economic dependence of the younger generation on the older while ensuring the old man's security. A will from a wealthy merchant in Augsburg, Germany in the 14th century specifies that his business and accumulated capital will pass to his eldest son, but also clearly dictates that his son must provide a substantial annual income and suitable living quarters, along with a servant to attend to his needs. This demonstrates the father's continued economic power and ability to dictate terms even in old age. A farmer might gradually reduce his physical labor in the fields, but he would still make decisions about crops, livestock, and sales. His years of experience and knowledge of the land were considered valuable assets, contributing to the family's overall economic well-being. His position as the head of the household, even if symbolic, allowed him to maintain control over household finances and resources. For older men who were not landowners but skilled craftsmen, their accumulated tools, apprentices, and established customer base represented their continued economic power. An aging blacksmith might no longer swing the heaviest hammer, but his expertise in metalwork, his established workshop, and his apprentices ensured a steady income and his continued economic relevance within the community, even if he reduced his active working hours. The fruits of his previous labor continued to provide for him. For those with no heirs, or who had fallen on hard times, some older men might resort to entering a monastery which often required a payment or transfer of property in exchange for lifelong care and spiritual contemplation. Others might rely on communal charity or the limited provisions of almshouses, though the emphasis for men was often on maintaining their economic independence for as long as possible. The economic trajectory for an aging man was typically one of gradual transition of labor, but retention of ultimate control over his accumulated wealth and means of production. Underpinned by strong customary and legal frameworks, for older women, their economic standing and control over property in old age presented a vastly different and often more challenging landscape. A woman's economic security was, for much of her life, inextricably linked to her husband or male relatives. Upon marriage, her dowry often became part of her husband's property, even if legally she retained some claim to it. In old age, particularly upon widowhood, her economic situation could become precarious. While the concept of dower rights was intended to provide for a widow, typically granting her use of 1/3 of her husband's land or income for her lifetime, the enforcement and practicality of these rights varied greatly. A widow might struggle to secure her dower from her deceased husband's heirs, particularly if the land was contested or if her sons were uncooperative. Legal disputes over dower rights were common, suggesting that it was not always a straightforward provision. A record from a manorial court in Essex, England, in the late 14th century, details a protracted legal battle between a widow and her deceased husband's brother over the precise boundaries and income of her dower land, highlighting the challenges she faced in securing her economic rights. Furthermore, a widow typically did not inherit the primary family property outright. While she could use a portion of it, the ultimate ownership usually passed to her sons or other male heirs. This meant that she often remained dependent on her children for her living arrangements and daily sustenance, even if she had some independent income from her dower. Her economic control was often indirect or limited to the portion of property she could claim. A widow who did not have sons, or whose sons had died, was in an even more vulnerable position. She might be forced to rely on her late husband's brothers or other male relatives, or, in the worst cases, charity. For women who were not part of landowning families, such as peasant women or urban laborers, their economic prospects in old age were often directly tied to their continued ability to perform labor. An older woman might continue to spin, weave, brew ale, or engage in petty trading for as long as her health allowed. However, as physical frailty set in, her ability to earn a living diminished significantly. Unlike a male craftsman who might oversee apprentices, an older woman often relied on her own physical capacity. The income from such labor was often meager, barely enough for subsistence. If a woman had no surviving children, or her children were too poor to support her, her options were severely limited. Many elderly widows ended up relying on the charity of the church, local almshouses, or their communities. Records from various charitable institutions in medieval towns show a disproportionately high number of elderly women among those receiving alms or shelter, pointing to their acute economic vulnerability. These institutions were often the last resort for women who had exhausted all other avenues of support. Some women, particularly those from more prosperous backgrounds who were widowed, might enter convents, transferring their personal wealth or dower rights to the convent in exchange for lifelong care and spiritual devotion. This offered a degree of economic security, but it also meant renouncing the secular world and any control over her assets. Unlike men who often retain the ultimate ownership and direct control of family property until death, older women often found their economic standing to be contingent, precarious, and frequently dependent on the goodwill and ability of their male relatives, or the provisions of charitable institutions. This fundamental difference in economic control and security created vastly diverging experiences of old age for medieval men and women.